You are listening to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com to get more information. All right, on to the show. Welcome to this episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined by Brian Weiss of ITECH Solutions. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you for having me.
So, Brian, I recently read this magazine article that was August of this year that talks about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And before we get into that, if you could tell our audience a little bit about your history in bringing about ITECH and a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the meat of what happens when a ransomware attack cripples a company.
Sure. So ITECH, we started in 2005, primarily as a break-fix company, like most early MSPs when they get started. And about 2008, when the recession hit, is when we got into MSP, kind of the fixed rate managed services. And from 2005 to about 2012, we focused, on a decent amount of growth. And then we started adopting additional tools to use. Our first tool was actually in 2008 with an RMM product. But as many MSPs know, that's kind of where you get hooked on tools. And then you start adding more to your stack to try to automate things. And that was kind of the journey we were on is, how many tools can we get to help automate our job and make our life easier, right? And so we were on a big push, and even, past 2012, really looking at how can we grow really fast, and part of that was automation of tools. So we were really focused on internal efficiencies, getting more clients, and of course, the cloud was there, and we're getting clients out to the cloud. And so we essentially grew to a company of 13 employees with about 70 clients by 2018 when the event happened. And we were on track to do 1.8 million that year. So we were at a point where we were kind of excited to start even looking into the acquisition space, where maybe, buying up another MSP to grow faster. It was just all about growth, right? Get as many clients as you can, automate processes. So there wasn't a high focus on security. We were aware of MFA in 2018, obviously even before that, and had this struggle where the current RMM we were using didn't have built-in MFA, so it required like a third-party integration, which was kind of a pain. And the other thing is the RMM was an in-house managed, on our own server. So we were really looking for something that was cloud-based. So 2018 March, we were in the middle of migrating to a new RMM software when the breach happened on our old RMM software.
So Brian, before we jump into that, I want to sort of recap, if you will, because you said some things that I think are really important for every MSP to hear. One is you either at some point were a lifestyle company. We all were, right? We started out, we're like, we made the decision to start an MSP because we could do it better than somebody else, whether we were working for a company that we were the in-house IT, et cetera. And then we get out there and we started making money and we're like, wow, I really like this. And at some point we transitioned the model to, I want it to be more than that. Maybe you've onboarded a business partner, you got a couple employees, suddenly this starts to feel like I can do more. And I think every MSP out there probably can feel some of the pain on the growth side that you're talking about. But I also think that as you started to talk about security and leading up to what your focus was, and then this event happened, I question how many MSPs at what point in their business model of growing the MSP did they start really focusing on any sort of security, whether it be, process and procedure or how to onboard a client, this mindset now that we hear of security first. What are your thoughts on that as we get into, especially in hindsight?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think a lot of it has to do with the type of clients you serve as well and what their risk tolerance is. And so, we're in a small market, San Luis Obispo, California, and we've got about 250,000 people in our county, that we service. So a lot of smaller businesses that aren't really thinking security. And of course, in the early days, all you needed was like an antivirus product, right?
Right.
And you felt, or in a firewall.
Sure.
So it wasn't top of mind because our clients weren't asking for it, and because we just weren't educated on a proper, security policy or protocols like CIS or NIST and everything that goes into that. So, we were looking at growing a company, making more money, not necessarily, how do we secure our existing income that we've already obtained, like our normal recurring revenue. And we didn't realize how high of a risk it was to potentially lose that as well.
Sure. Do you think that, so I actually came a bit from that same market, which is interesting because when I started my MSP, our primary premise was the healthcare space, but we weren't doing it from a security perspective. We were doing it because every medical practice we talked to said, hey, if we get these certain things done and can prove that we've done it a certain way, we get all this money. And we're like, awesome. So you're going to pay us to implement based on the idea that you're going to get money down the road. We probably were similar to where you were at in the 7-8 years into our company before security came knocking on our door. Now, granted, I didn't ever have to deal with this breach we're about to talk about, but I can tell you that when clients started asking about things that we should have probably been at the forefront of everything we did, it was tough to shift from, we've layered all these things into this monthly reoccurring package when we transitioned from that break fix to, I'll say air quotes here, true managed services by the definitions of those of like the Gary Pica or Paul Dipple, right? Like we're going to do this and we can quantify and qualitatively just show how much we're doing. And then suddenly the security stuff that we're going to talk about here in a little bit start to become paramount to doing that well. And yet we've set our clients up to say, well, aren't you already including those things? And that just makes this whole process complicated. So Brian, let's jump into it. Talk to me about this event that we've been alluding to that happened one fateful day in 2018.
I want to add one more thing real quick, kind of to your point. Even when I think back to if I would have known what I know now back then, security isn't easy to sell. It's not like the traditional tool or, service that you're putting in place for your client where it's adding some sort of workflow benefit.
Sure.
Where it's making their lives easier. Like that was kind of, I think back in the day before security, it was all about telling our clients, hey, this is how we make your lives easier, right? Let's put this software in, let's get this network set up, let's do this so you can work remotely. And it was all about making their lives easier. But now when I'm implementing security, a lot of it is hindering workflows, and if you don't do it right, it actually makes their lives harder. MFA, major pushback still we get from clients to not want to have to do a code on their phone,
Well, and now you're talking to clients where they want to implement 2FA and the end users have their own personal cell phones. And they're like, I don't want my work stuff on my cell phone. And so it's, okay, now we're talking about these added costs that, as an MSP, it's like, well, you just load this on your phone and it's like, no big deal. And it's really convenient. You just hit acknowledge and they're like, yeah, I don't want it on my phone.
So I put myself in the shoes of myself back then. And even if I knew what I knew now, short of the PTSD I got from the event, where I just know, okay, I'm not willing to take on risk,
Sure.
which again, I wouldn't have had back then. But the client ultimately comes and says, why do I need this? I haven't needed this for the past 5 years or 10 years. Why do I need this now? You know,
Right.
what evidence can you show me that I actually need this service? Because I'm going to pay more money and it's going to essentially hinder my workflows, you know?
Right. Who cares, right? Like I'm this little company. I'm not a Microsoft. I'm not a,
Yeah.
large enterprise. Why me? And so yeah, let's talk about the why ITECH.
So yeah, why ITECH? We were in the early days of when these, attacks were happening, when they were targeting, these threat actors were targeting MSPs. It was before it's widespread on the news like it is today. So that was the other kind of kicker, is we had no idea it could even potentially happen. I mean, it wasn't at the front of our minds, let's put it
Sure.
that way, right? So when we're in the middle of this migration, it's March, I'm excited. I feel like we are upgrading our security. So the last thing I feel like is, we're doing something wrong right now by not using MFA, because we're on this track to get into this new RMM with MFA. And basically, I come into the office Monday morning and we've got a bunch of clients calling in saying they can't access their files, right? We identify that it's a ransomware variant, and which was the WannaCry. And we're wondering, is there like a new version of this, maybe that's just really people are falling for or something?
Sure.
So I spent probably the first hour after finding out just looking on the internet, Reddit, blogs, anywhere, looking for news about some new ransomware variant, Twitter, anywhere where you typically see people talking about things like this. And I couldn't find anything. It was like crickets. And so I'm scratching my head. I'm going crazy. We're logging all these tickets. I'm working with my team to formulate a plan before one of my engineers walks in and goes, hey, I noticed a pattern with these clients that got hit. They happen to still all be on our old RMM software. And that's when like my heart just sank. I was like, oh my God, are you serious? Because I knew exactly what had happened the minute I heard that. And it wasn't at the front of my mind that it could happen, but the minute I heard about that, I was like, okay, that happened.
Yeah.
So to confirm that, I pulled the SQL logs from our server and saw the account they were using that had become compromised. What we found out is by a phishing email, essentially. And it literally showed timestamps of every time they logged, in and out, as well as every single device they accessed.
Oh man.
So that was, I guess, the silver lining at the time, is we had the scope of what was accessed, right? Which if you don't have that, then you're like going through a haystack trying to find everything.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because as we know, with MSP-Ignite and us going through the CIS top 20, if you have just turned on audit logs, logging period, you have a chance, right? And so people are like, well, that just doesn't seem like doing enough. And you're really highlighting right now, because of those log files,
Yep.
you were able to pinpoint and define the scope of the breach.
Yeah, so that gave us kind of our roadmap as far as who was affected, what was affected. At that point in time, we started proactively reaching out to clients that hadn't even contacted us yet, and letting them know that there's been a ransomware infection. The thing that most MSPs probably question, if this would, if you put yourself in my shoes and say, okay, if this happened to me, what would I do? I've heard some MSPs just ghost their clients, or don't, or lie to them and try to make it sound like it didn't happen through them, right? Through one of their
Sure.
tools. And that didn't even cross my mind. I was just like, we have to tell all of these clients right now that it was our fault, right?
Sure. Well, and a lie would have come back and probably bit even harder once it was determined that you were the source of the breach.
Yeah, and I felt like we were doing the right things to try to
Sure.
prevent this. We just got caught in the middle of this migration, between the two RMMs. And so my position and kind of message to the clients is like, this is what happened. We're doing everything in our power to get you up and running as quickly as possible, and we will do everything in our power after this cleanup to prevent this type of thing from happening again, right? And just regularly communicating with them was and being transparent is something I highly recommend doing.
So did you kind of end up like, I don't want to call it a call center, like emergency triage? Did you, so what happened? You basically went from, you've got a scope now, you've got, these tickets coming in, my machine, I can't get to files. Um, did you have like you were triaging like based on worst to least impacted, or was there more of like, it was all kind of the same and you were just kind of turn your finger and point?
So unfortunately, because we didn't have an incident response plan in place, we literally were making one on the fly. And we never even gone through the thought process of what if this happens to us, right? How are we going to react? It was unfortunately a squeaky wheel reaction, right? So
Sure.
there were the clients that were the squeaky wheels got the most attention. And when we did our kind of post-mortem and met with clients after this happened, one of the questions was, what could we have done that would have been better? And communication with some other clients was on that list, more regular communication. So one of the things we did right after this is we said, okay, if we ever run into a situation like this again, we're having one person be solely responsible, kind of the point person, who's like making sure all of the clients are regularly communicated to. Any vendors or third, insurance companies we're working with, they're kind of the central hub, right?
Like a
That
PR
everyone
person.
exactly that everyone
Gotcha.
communicates with. So that was, luckily we only lost 2 clients out of 34 that got hit. But that's something we could have done better, even though we did good enough to keep all of those clients.
So, real quick, I don't want to spend a ton of time on it. What do you think was sort of for those 2 clients that left? What was the, you were transparent, honest. You said it happened to us. What was the feedback that you got from them?
So one of them we were kind of already looking to part ways with. They were closing down one of their offices and kind of looking to use a different IT company closer to where their main office was. So that one, we probably would have lost anyway. The other one had new management, so we hadn't really built the trust with them yet. And naturally, when something like this happens, they're a lot likely to consider jumping ship, right? Changing IT vendors.
No, I think that's really telling. I mean, I think we all are going to expect some sort of attrition with our client portfolio at that, usually it's not till you've hit that 3-year marker with most clients, but if you haven't established trust and you got something like this happening, I think that's a pretty awesome testimony to how you've worked through this. So that kind of leads me to sort of the transition piece. You spent this sort of 3 to 4 weeks, maybe a little longer, just trying to address and get everybody back online. Um, Obviously, there's a lot of emotion that goes into this. It's in the article, when "Wanna Cry Makes You Wanna Cry." You're in this process. What was like the next chapter as you kind of hit that aha moment that says we can keep plowing through?
So, so after we got the SQL logs, we then evaluated kind of what happened, like what was the damage. And so what they had done, just to, from a technical understanding, what happened is, our old RMM had this awesome feature where if you didn't lock or log off the session when you disconnected, it would just leave it logged in essentially, right? So these threat actors were going in one by one, remotely accessing each device. And if one was already logged in, they would be, they'd have desktop access, and in a lot of cases, even admin, local admin, right? So they essentially went in and they disabled the antivirus software. They looked for any backups on the network to try to delete those. and then, deployed the ransomware variant. What was interesting though is, and we didn't spend a lot of time looking into this just because we had a lot of other things on our plate, but it seems like it was almost like a delayed payload, because a lot of these clients actually do work over the weekend, and we did have some monitoring capabilities to be able to identify certain things that were happening. Yet we didn't really notice much over the weekend. So it was almost like they were trying to do just enough over the weekend to widen their grasp, I should say, on our devices. And then it was like Monday morning, all of a sudden everything hit. We still saw ransomware running that Monday morning that we were able to kill off and stop.
Got it.
So
so they were looking to widen the payload as much as possible, which I think without raising the alarms.
Alerting us.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and I think that's the nature of any sort of phishing attack, social engineering, where they're getting those pieces to take action instantly upon finding out they can get into a system, would actually not be in their best interest, because odds are if they attack immediately, yeah, they got one client, not all your clients, right? So yeah, that's totally understandable. And if you're listening to this, make sure that you take note of just because you think you squashed it doesn't mean you got it everywhere.
Yeah. So yeah, it was, the minute we realized how much work there was to do, because, a lot of times we had to restore from backups of backups. We hired 4 additional, staff members. We put all projects on hold. I pre-approved all overtime. I had my guys working overtime, as much as they could. I hired a PR company to be on standby as well, in case it got out. Luckily it didn't. And contacted my insurance company, of course, and essentially spent 2 weeks fixing it on our own, telling the client or telling the insurance company, hey, we're restoring all of these from backup. Now, they do it a lot differently now. If the minute you get the insurance company involved, they immediately want a security company to come in and evaluate what's going on before you make any changes.
Do forensics.
Yep, they want forensics. And so this was in the early days before they really had their processes down. And they literally, I kind of wish it was like it was now, because it would have been a lot easier for us.
And let's talk about early days. We're talking about 2 years, right? When we say early days. Yeah, which is really scary. I mean, we talk about cybersecurity or we talk about MSPs, and we shrink our timeline from, I've been doing this for 20 plus years. It's forever. And we're talking about in the early days of, 24 months ago.
Yeah. So we did all the work. I tracked all my expenses, and they ultimately brought in a third-party security company to then do forensics after our cleanup to make sure there was no remnants left behind. And that was kind of how they were able to sign off that, this looks good.
So to some extent, it's like you brought in the cleaners.
Yeah.
So as so just to kind of recap here, timeline on this, we're how far in? 2 weeks, 3 weeks in?
So 2 weeks to get everyone back up and running. And then it was probably another 2 weeks just to kind of put the pieces back together and, working with, the insurance company took about a year working with them on this whole thing. But before we were back to what I call normal operations, it was a total of about 4 weeks.
Okay.
That was when we could start picking up projects again that we had put on hold. And when we were, back to normal size staff again. And one of the guys I hired, I actually kept on.
Okay.
He worked out so great. I was like, hey, I'll just keep you on. I didn't let go any employees, because my team I couldn't have gotten through it without my team. If we want to talk emotions, I was not sleeping, not eating, drinking way too much, medicating to get through it. It was a business ending, easily overnight could have ended my business. And
right.
if it wasn't for my team being able to do all the legwork of getting everyone up and running, and the long relationship we had with our clients, I probably would have lost maybe half of my clients, or this could have gone public.
So let's fast forward a little bit. I think this is a good segue. So you took your reactive, let's survive this 2 to 4 weeks that went into that before you could get back to a state of normalcy. You're reactive to proactive. So now you kind of are looking at this going, okay, what tools and products and services did you have to evaluate that helped you get through this? Or maybe were in hindsight starting to get put on the evaluation as part of, say, new initiatives, talking about whether or not you wanted to be an MSSP or have that focus of security first managed service provider. All those things kind of now coming to the forefront of everything that you're doing. Talk to me about that and about your decisions to not pursue any new clients.
So yeah, everyone's back up, dust is settled. I only lost 2 clients. And now I'm sitting here going, okay, how am I going to prevent this from happening again? And, I'm looking at the losses. I mean, we're at about $500,000 total losses that I had calculated. About 250K of hard losses, where it's like money out of the bank, right? The insurance company, after battling with them for a year, only ended up giving me 150K. So, we lost growth. We were on track to be 1.8 million. We finished that year with only 1.56 million and a negative 2% profit margin. So, it was definitely a situation where it's like, okay, we survived this, but I'm not going to sit here and go back to normal operations now like we were before. And so it really opened up my eyes. The PTSD made me realize clients are a shared risk. And the MSP business model, thank goodness it's such a great model with recurring revenue, made me realize that I can survive without having to take on new clients. That was the other realization. Because I was hesitant to want to take on a new client without knowing I could secure them properly. I was worried about all our existing clients still not being secured properly. I was realizing, hey, we're getting targeted, and my first thought is we're going to become an MSSP. So I spent about 6 months just burying my head into security. I got off on the CIS 1 through 20 controls, which I initially looked into, and then NIST later, where I was really just trying to find every tool. Mind you, I was still in that set of a tool can do this for me. Right? And so I'm trying to find all these tools that are going to help me meet all these requirements for CIS. And I developed this huge stack. I mean, looking at a ton of enterprise level products, I basically built something out that could potentially be used for an MSSP, but I realized that these aren't my clients. My clients wouldn't sign up for an MSSP. I don't want to compete with like the Robert Herjavec group, right? Who's an MSSP. The minute I call myself an MSSP, I'm like in that upper echelon, right? Of performance.
Well, I would raise the question, what does that really even mean? Because we see vendors that provide, a very specific service in the realm of a SIEM tool, a firewall management service, and they call themselves an MSSP. So I know the language is a bit semantics, but we would get ourselves in a world of hurt as a strong MSP, suddenly changing the language around who we are to a client that has known us for 5, 10, 15 years, and now we're something that we weren't yesterday.
Yep. So, and I argued that same thing. It's semantics. I had people trolling me online. Oh, you can't be an MSSP. I was like, oh, we're security first, so therefore we are. I mean, the definition I came down to is, to be an MSSP, you really need to have security professionals on staff, right?
I would agree that that's the definition that we should be embracing as MSPs. However, the world around us views an MSSP as someone who does have that mindset of security first. So I think it's getting into making sure that our clients and prospect clients know that we take security serious and never change our name.
Yeah. So I went way overboard. I probably wasted, well, I don't want to say I wasted 3 months of my life, because I did learn kind of like, if I'm going to go full bore, here's what it looks like. But I realized full bore isn't what my clients need, and it's too hard to sell to my clients, and I need to step back and do the crawl, walk, run approach, right? I was trying to run before I really learned how to crawl.
Sure. And
And it was,
everybody wants to sell you a product or a service. So you could easily have been well on your way to being something you never want to be, but you've got all the products and services to go with it and do it if you had the resources to support it.
yeah. So then I dug into the CIS controls and looked at it from a different angle. Well, more of like, what's the minimum my clients need? And that's where I started looking at the layered security model, right?
Sure.
You have the old castle back in the day. They even used it back in the medieval times. You have all these things to prevent people from getting inside, these different layers where one fails, you have another one to be there to back it up.
Right.
And I started looking at the layers, and I realized that we had spent all this time moving our clients to the cloud, and we're relying on the cloud security, or the security of the cloud vendor, and just thinking, okay, everything's okay, I don't have to worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
But we weren't doing anything about identity security, right? And the idea that, okay, you could have the most secure vendor in the world out in the cloud, but your user credentials get you right into, through all their security.
Sure.
And so it's essentially like the new edge, if you will, right? We think of firewalls back in the day, being kind of the edge to protect our clients from everything evil out in the internet.
Sure.
Well, now that we have everything out in the internet in cloud-based form, your identity is kind of that edge out on the internet before they can get in. And so that's where we focused a lot, is around MFA. How can we secure people's identities? And I feel like I'm jumping a little ahead. I mean, we cleaned up our own house first, right, around all of these things. And the other item was just, hey, one of my own techs got phished.
Right.
What type of like phishing security can I put in? What about some training?
Right.
That's a big one. So, when it comes to identity security, I realized we need a single source of truth, number one.
Right.
I need to be able to manage all of the users for my client. If it's not happening on a local domain server, which nowadays that gets harder and harder, what are we using? And that's when I went with the Microsoft stack, Azure, Intune. And then you can kind of build around that. And I started learning more about the Microsoft stack and realizing that they've got a fair amount out of the box if you buy their hiring licensing.
Mm-hmm.
That really help you follow a lot of the NIST framework and CIS framework without having to add on all these tools, or rely that the client is going to follow proper policy.
And I think it's important that you mentioned that you don't have to spend all this money to necessarily get some of the answers that are critical in locking down an environment. I mean, you look at, SANS Institute being really behind CIS Top 20, and they have a whole write-up on how to secure the small business without spending any money. And I've read it, I don't know, a dozen times, and it gets me every time that I'm reading something that tells me how to do something for little to no cost. And yet when we have the conversations with other MSPs, they're like, yeah, but I get this product from this vendor that does XYZ. And how do I make that solve the problem, instead of what you're proposing is something else that's free, but it's not shiny object. And we still have to get out of our own way with that shiny object syndrome. I think that I admit I am a member of that group that needs to have the therapy that says, no, Chris, don't buy that. Just because it's a really good deal, you don't necessarily need that to solve your problem. So you're now well into this. You've started to adopt Microsoft Stack and some other products and services. And obviously going forward, it's not like you're going to just stop, that you've hit a good spot to say no more products, no more additional items. But where you're at today, do you feel confident in that where you're at and what you've put in place is giving you some peace of mind around it is going to happen again, right? It's not a question of if, it's a when. But I believe that what you've told me and shared with me is that you can minimize the repercussions. You've got some PR type stuff in place. Are there any specific, I'd hate to get into products and services because I really don't think that's what we're about is, hey, buy Microsoft as opposed to some other vendor's product. But I think there's something in there that I want to hear you tell the audience that says, as long as I'm doing these key things, then there's a ability for me to continue to improve as I go forward.
So it's without going through an event like I went through, I would say the hardest part is finding the time, right? And it's never going to be perfect. Right now, I feel like we have enough in place for me to be able to sleep at night. But I'm not for one instance not continually thinking about security every week and rethinking about what we have in place and how you could potentially get around the protection or the policies. And so that's the brainstorming that I think is very important, is to understand that if you put a tool in place or you put a policy in place that you know is going to protect a certain layer, the next question you ask yourself is say, okay, well, what if that doesn't work? Where's the next layer of protection? Back in the day, for all of us, it was backup, right?
Sure.
Worst case scenario, I've got a good backup. I can always restore the data. But now, even with ransomware, that was the case, right? But now they're actually exfiltrating data and threatening to make it public. So, you can't just rely on the backup anymore, right?
Well, I think that's kind of the key here is that, and we've heard that when we did the Datto roundtable, one of the things that Ryan Weeks said was a product shouldn't be what you build a process around. A product or service should complements or fills a gap within your process. So as we look at this sort of beyond survival for ITECH, and you're starting back into that grow your business, how does the conversation start? What are some key takeaways that we could share with our listeners that says, hey, do these things first? And of course, you can always plug, get involved in MSP-Ignite and some other areas where we know that there's some good, I'm going to say hand holding, because I think that's what we all need, is to stand around in the circle and hold hands, because together we are strong. On our own, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, peer groups are definitely a huge, if you're not already part of a peer group, I highly recommend it. Let's put it that way. Mainly because you have other like-minded, owners or managers doing the same thing as you. And it really helps you avoid making mistakes they've already made. And especially when it comes down to talking security, everyone, I find, MSPs know that aren't, MSSPs or security professionals, they do know security, but maybe they're good at firewalls, or maybe they're good at endpoint protection, or maybe they're good at mail security. Like, depending on what you put more of your emphasis on, identity security, you come together as a team and you share ideas. You can also share, what tool didn't work to do X, Y, Z. But most importantly, with an MSP peer group, is they can hold you accountable. And I think that's really what's needed when it comes to security, because we all can probably say, yes, security is important, but how do we know that security is important enough to stay at the top of your priority list so that you're regularly working on that and improving it? And that's where a peer group comes in to kind of give you that accountability and, make you feel bad if you didn't work on that last week or something,
So I'm going to throw one in there that I know is part of your survival kit, and you alluded to it a little bit, is that, and we heard this from the Datto roundtable, accountability obviously is key. We get that from being part of peer groups. The second one is, what are you aligning your security strategy around? You've got to have a framework or some sort of like control set that can be consistently used over and over again. Obviously, at MSP-Ignite, we use the CIS top 20. I believe that's a great starting point because it's uniquely identified to walk through a control set, one control at a time in a sequential order. But you also alluded to NIST 171. Talk to me just briefly as we're getting to that point of starting to run out of time here. What made you start to shift in that direction?
So it seems to be more widely used in the industry, and I hear the CMMC cybersecurity maturity model is going to be based on that. If you go into Microsoft's secure score area or their compliance module, I should say, you can actually load up a NIST framework that it will then grade your environment against.
Sure.
So I personally like the CIS top 20 better because they're a little more technical, and I'm a technical guy, right? But NIST seems to be kind of the overarching framework that I see a lot of industries, relating to, especially around like training or certifications.
Sure. So I think that's a great answer. I believe that ultimately, even within MSP-Ignite and secure outcomes, that there is a shift at some point that says you're going to need to look deeper than what we can cover in CIS top 20. But I think you can attest to, we all can, is that if you start there, you will mature to the point where you will recognize the need to go beyond what we've done to get, we've wet the wick, right? So I like it. I really appreciate you pointing out those two things. Is there one other, maybe a third? If I'm saying survival kit, what's the one other thing that you would put in that bag, go bag, if you had to, if this were to happen again?
Well, I mean, I got to bring up insurance, and it's a little different than it was before. I'd also say partnering with an MSSP. Insurance now is going to guide you through that whole process. In fact, your first call should be the insurance company, because they're ultimately going to cover any damages that
Sure.
are unrecoverable. And so you're going to want to follow their guidance on how to handle this. They're going to bring in the teams that you need to help you. With an MSSP, being partnered with them, what I really love is that, the stress that this put on my team, that who knows how many years that took off of their lives, but I know it took some off of mine. To be able to have a pre-established relationship with a cybersecurity firm, and even if it's just a single client that gets hit, to be able to reach out to them for guidance and not have to have your team, who doesn't necessarily live and breathe security every day, they're familiar with it, but it's not something that they deal with every day.
Sure.
It's just a benefit for your team overall, in the sense that you can hand off and escalate to someone else. So just understanding that you don't have to be an MSSP. Start with the low-hanging fruit. The CIS controls are great. Identify the different layers. You've got your identity layer, your device layer, your network, your data. How are you protecting all of it? What processes are in place to protect data in all of these areas? And just knowing that you don't have to be the expert or the know-all, but you need to make sure you have a relationship with someone that you can reach out to should you need an expert that's predetermined.
Yeah, I hear you saying basically know what your strengths are,
Yep.
and then find an MSSP to partner with to fill in the gaps where you're weak.
And make an incident response plan, even if it's a page or 2 pages, and don't try to make some 60-page incident response, because you'll never use it.
Yeah, it's funny, as we run out of time here. Incident response is something that we definitely spend some quality time with regards to CIS top 20. But I think in order to have a good incident response plan, you got to have a good inventory and asset inventory. If you don't have that, you're always going to have an incident that you don't know about because you don't have your inventory under control.
Yep.
So with that, I'd like to thank Brian Weiss of ITECH Solutions for joining us for this episode of MSP 1337. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
This has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks for joining us.